Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
Today we start chapter 9, and by chapter 9 in Acts, Luke brings to the forefront this character we've only seen in glimpses, Saul. The name sent shivers down the back of the early church. We saw him in the crowd as Stephen was stoned to death. We heard whispers of his name in fearful tones as the church was persecuted and as Christians fled for their lives. And now, as the church ran out of the city of Jerusalem, this enemy was given a true face, and his name was known: Saulus Paulus of Tarsus. Violent and resourceful, skilled and ruthless. By chapter 9, he even takes the initiative to seek out and destroy the followers of Jesus, house by house and town by town if need be. Once the Sanhedrin gives him their blessing, once the chief priest hands him the letters, he sets off on the 140-mile journey to weed out the heresy of Jesus in the ancient city of Damascus. With temple guards as his companion, really his muscle, and search and arrest warrants in hand, he finds his way north. It's on his travels that he certainly would have passed through the region of Samaria, the ancient half-cousins of the Jewish people, where Philip had found a fertile soil for his preaching to the hungry there, wanting to hear a bit of good news, those who'd been converted and those who had found the Holy Spirit. He'd have to deal with them later, maybe on his way back home. Next, he would pass through the region of Galilee, where it all started, where this leader, this rabbi, rose up out of the dirt, out of the Sea of Galilee, to spew all this heresy, the things that he was confronting. Surely many of his followers would have retreated back there to their old lives as fishermen as the danger erupted in Jerusalem. Oh yes, he would certainly make Galilee a stop on his return trip. He would need to stop by to weed out the heresies of Jesus. But by Galilee, his journey was only half begun. He couldn't stop now. His eyes were set on the ancient city of Damascus. In Damascus, he would stamp out all of this rebellion to the orthodoxy. He would not fail. He could not fail, because after all, he had God on his side, right? How many Sauls has this world known? A crusader for God, a fury carrier, an orthodox flag bearer, a God defender. How many Sauls has this world known? Ones that rage, ones that breathe threats and murder, all in the name of God. How many Sauls has this world known? The Saul of orthodoxy, the Saul of the way things used to be. Far too many. Far too many Sauls have laid waste on their way to protect God. Only a fortunate few have ever really realized that God doesn't really need protecting. One of the great gifts of ministry handed to me many years ago from a retired minister. As I prepared for my first Sunday here, and as I prepared my very first sermon before you, he simply said, "Never fall into the trap of protecting God. God doesn't need your protection. He simply needs you to preach the truth." Saul falls into the trap. He's busy protecting God from all this unorthodoxy that is creeping up around him, so much so that he falls into the trap that he needs to protect God even if it means violence. Even if it means traveling up the road to Damascus, to bring back those who are followers of the way bound to Jerusalem. My preacher friend said, ministers should never be in the business of protecting God. God does not need protecting. Up the road lived a man of Damascus, a man named Ananias. Ananias had surely seen the Jerusalem refugees as they flow into town, those who had escaped the violence that had come after Stephen's death. And it may have even been one of those refugees who was the first to tell him of Jesus. The refugees would have brought the stories of Jesus with them, of his death, of his resurrection. They would have brought all the stories with him that the disciples would have told on the journeys through Galilee. And they would have brought one more story, the story of their friend Stephen, who had been stoned at the wall. The murder of Stephen was the reason why they all fled, why they all found themselves in Damascus to begin with. It was the dam that burst, proving that they were no longer safe. Ananias knew the danger certainly by the time Saul entered the city gates. He lived with this danger almost as a guest in his home. And when he heard that this scary man, this monstrous man, Saul, had traveled north, he must have realized that he could be next. Who could blame Ananias for balking at God's request? Are you sure? I've heard how much evil he has done to your saints. God calls on him to serve, that Saul might serve. And isn't that what we're called to do? As Jesus sits with his disciples on that last night, as he washes their feet, he doesn't call on them to protect him. He calls on them to serve one another and to serve others. Do you know what I've done to you? As I've washed your feet, wash the feet of others. And now Ananias is called on to serve God, even in the face of fear, even though it comes at a great cost. Ananias searches out the street straight. He enters the home of Judas. He approaches the monster of his nightmares. Step by step, he walks across the room and reaches a hand out carefully. His mouth opens, and he says, "Brother." And in that moment, the impossible happens. The monster is no longer a monster. He is changed. The God who changed death into life, the God who overturned crucifixion into resurrection, who had broken the fury and rage of death into new life, had given a new spirit. Created in this place, no longer a monster, but a brother. How many Ananiases has this world known? Ones who dared, ones who trusted, ones who reached out a hand. How many Ananiases has this world known? Ones who risked big, ones who spoke out, ones that served. Too few. Far too few Ananiases have stepped out into the streets with God's boldness, seeking out reconciliation from the monsters of their nightmares. Too few have desired the resurrection hope in the face of the terrors in this world. Far too few are ready to serve God, and far too many are ready to protect God. See, there's two big differences there. If you take the attitude that God needs to be protected, and you see that as your job, seeking to protect God makes enemies out of the other. Seeking to protect God makes enemies. Seeking to serve God prompts us to reach out and even see the other as family. I think that's a big difference. Protecting God and serving God. I think this has a lot to do with the political climate we find ourselves in today. Now, I'm not going to get overly political here. And I don't have to tell you that the rhetoric is absolutely toxic. That political bases are raging and at war. Our language divides us, separates us as we seek to protect. Protect an orthodoxy to the way that things had always been. That seeking out of protection divides us from the other. It forces us to see enemies. Too few in our political landscape are, at least seem, ready to serve. Serving others. Serving prompts us to reach out from our own interests, to reach out from our secure places. Too few Ananiases, too many Sauls. Saul's way is to wage war against those that think differently. Saul's way is bitterness. It is hurtful. It is attacking, and at the end of it all, it is death. God calls Ananias out into the street and out into hope. Hope through serving God, not protecting God. By his courageous hand, the world will never be the same. Saul becomes Paul. The monster becomes the missionary. Death and destruction are given the body of resurrection. So God calls us out into the street straight, asking us to dare, to trust, to serve, to reach out to others, and to see the other as sister and brother. If Christ is resurrected, if Saul can become Paul, then there is no situation in our personal relationships, in our communities, or in our nation that cannot be transformed when we seek out to serve rather than protect. That will happen when we learn that God does not need our protecting. God needs our serving. So the simple question at the end of the day is this: would you rather serve, or would you rather protect? It all starts when we hear our name called. May we answer as Ananias answered. Here I am, Lord. Let us go as disciples, eager to serve. Amen and amen.